Hi, welcome everyone. I see that there are a total of 12 attendees with us right now. Just be a little patient with us. We'll wait for another couple of minutes for other, confirmed attendees to join, and then we'll start. Just a few more minutes. Maybe during this time, I can do a quick check to ensure that you guys can hear us and see us. In case you're not able to, just post it on the chat window or the question panel, so that we know that you're not able to hear us or you're not able to see us. Great. So I'm assuming that everything's working fine. Technically, we are all set. So just to brief you, out of all the attendees, we have it's great that we have a global attendance right now. I am, broadcasting from Gurgaon, India. Moksha, where are you situated right now?
I'm in Udaipur, Rajasthan.
Yeah.
India.
So I think we're good to go. Anyhow, the initial few slides is just an introduction. So we'll hope that everybody would join while we're just setting up the webinar. Great. So let me begin by thanking you all for taking out time and welcome you to this seminar. The seminar is about accessibility testing. We'll get into the details of accessibility testing, how it is done, and the need of it. Now, before I proceed, just to get the housekeeping in order, please note during this entire session, the panelists, the presenters, will have their mics and their cameras in the switched on mode. I request that all the attendees keep their mics and cameras off, and that's the default mode that they are in right now. Now, let me introduce the panelists to you. This is me. I'm the Senior Solution Architect aligned with CresTech. I have a total of 12 plus years of experience in the software testing industry. In my tenure with CresTech, I have been an integral part of setting up and maturing the Accessibility Center of Excellence. And I have drafted a couple of solutions for some clients related to accessibility testing. Excuse me. With me, I have Moksha Nandawar. She is basically our internal champion on accessibility. With a total 8 years of experience, she has tested multiple web and mobile applications on, accessibility standards like WCAG 2.0 and 2.1. She joins us as the subject matter expert on this.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here, and I look forward for the interaction towards the end.
Thanks, Moksha. Okay, so some of you might not know about CresTech who joined us. Just to give you a quick introduction about our company. Both Moksha and me are from CresTech Software Systems, which was established in 2005. Now, we have around 300 plus, testers. And with all these software testing experts, we have a comprehensive set of test offerings. And all that we do, all that we understand is software testing. We are a very passionate group of disruptors, and we're all mostly multi-skilled. So we definitely believe in investing in ourselves and upskilling all our resources. A case in point here is Moksha, who's right now is a subject matter expert on accessibility. But Moksha, I believe you would have worked on multiple projects during your tenure here and different services, right?
Yes, Manisha. So in my tenure in CresTech, I've been involved in multiple type of testing, that is functional testing, mobile testing, and accessibility testing being my core skill.
Yeah, great, thanks. So let's now jump into the webinar and what the webinar is going to be about. So the main points of the webinar would be coupled in two groups. The first part of the webinar is where we explain web accessibility. We talk about why it is needed, the various standards of web accessibility, and we get into WCAG guidelines, principles, and specifically the structure of 2.1. Then the second, more extensive part of the entire session is on accessibility testing. The process that we follow to do this kind of testing, the approach we take to execution, the test lab, and more around this. So now, what is web accessibility? How do you define it? Now, web is a source of umpteen amount of information for everybody. Now, the concept of web accessibility is as simple as the fact that make the same content accessible or available to specially abled individuals also. That's the concept. Now, this was an initiative started by Worldwide Web Consortium under the Web Accessibility Initiative, where they brought about a set of guidelines and a set of principles on which these guidelines were based to make any web application accessible. Now, that's the concept about web accessibility. But Moksha, I would request you here to talk about in terms of a particular application. So if I'm a product owner or if I'm a quality manager, what does web accessibility mean to me? What does making my application accessible imply here?
So in terms of product owner or quality manager, the accessibility of application, it revolves around its end users. Web accessibility is to ensure that the application is accessible by all its potential audience. So disabilities can come in many forms, from complete blindness to temporary disabilities, but sometimes what we consider to be minor, those factors can make it very difficult to browse the web. So product owner, they need to concentrate on specific disability if they apply.
Okay, so it's basically for a product owner, I need to know what my user base is. Is it controlled, uncontrolled? Know what kind of specially able people might be using my application and make it accessible accordingly.
Yes,
Okay,
Manisha,
great.
So now let's talk about why do we need accessibility testing. Now, building accessible sites benefit everyone. Some of the major reasons are like as information providers, we are obligated ethically to address the special needs of people when putting content on the web. So, in accessible web, it can help especially able people more actively participate in the society. Then, market share, a business that has the potential of reaching a new whole section of customers who may have been totally overlooked by their competitors. Then it can enhance your SEO. So accessibility improvises SEO, making your site more findable. And apart from improvising your SEO, it makes test automation of the application easier. And then we have legal implications. So by making a website accessible, the chances of facing legal actions are minimized. So these are some of the generic reasons for accessibility. Manisha, what do you think could be the major reason for considering accessibility testing?
Uh, Moksha, let me answer that in terms of the kind of recent needs that we have seen that have come to us through clients as to what were the motivations for them to consider accessibility. I think out of these four, the first one would be market share. Now, any organization that is launching a new product or is entering a new market would want to dominate most of it and not ignore close to 20% of the market share, which basically falls into the specially abled category. So there, where we've seen, edtech companies or retailers coming to us and saying that, their motivation of getting accessible applications or making accessible applications has been market share. The other one has been, for larger organizations, it has been more to do with legal implications or just being brand conscious and having a good name in the industry by following and making sure that they're socially responsible. So yeah, so these two are the major factors that I've seen.
That's interesting. However, just to let you know, no matter what the reason is for attaining web accessibility, the approach and way we test the application remains the same. Now,
Okay.
yeah. So now let's talk about web accessibility standards we have worldwide. Uh, Here we will talk about web accessibility efforts around the world and highlight some of the countries that have adopted and implemented an accessible web design or web design policy or law. So different countries have different accessibility laws or policy defined, like the US has Section 508, ADA, and a few more. Canada has Canadian Human Rights Act and a few more, and UK has DRC. Europe has Unified Evaluation Methodology 1.2, and these were the few of the standards. But there's a set of guidelines that encompasses all these standards, and that is WCAG, which is Web Content Accessibility Guideline, and the latest being its variation, WCG 2.2. They are not necessarily a standard, but they are a set of guidelines that you can use to build your own accessible content. And all these standards, which are in different countries, they at some point refer to WCG variations.
Yeah. So what we're trying to see here is basically WCAG as a set of guidelines falls at the core of making applications accessible, and it's a globally accepted guideline and standardization. Now let's look at what WCAG is based on. Now there are four principles that it's based on, and please know that even the testing that we're going to talk about later is based on these four principles as well. The first is perceivability. It's the idea that any web application can be conceived or perceived by a specially able person as well, if it can relate to more than one sense. Don't make it dependent on just one sense. An example here would be if there's any kind of information that we're trying to portray through an image, whereas there's no alternative text associated with it. Now, a disabled or a person who's accessing that web application would probably use a screen reader to go through the application. Now, that screen reader would not be able to read the image, and that's where you're sending information through one sense, which is not perceivable by a specially able person. So making all the information perceivable and not just relying on one sense is one of the things, one of the guiding principles. The next one, and this is basically operable. This talks that once you have perceived the information, you should be able to act on that information and operate the application. So, for example, I have, as a specially able person, I have jitters, and I want to be able to click on a button, which is sort of like a call to action button after a certain information that I've perceived. Now, if I have jitters, for me to use a mouse and go to that button and click on it is difficult. But what can be done is make the same button reachable through keyboard navigation. So that's another way of me being able to operate the application. And that's what the guide principle talks about. The next one is understandable. Now we've perceived the information, we have operated on the information, but one understandable is another principle which says that even if you're able to perceive it, operate it, you might not be able to understand it, because here think about people with cognitive issues who would not be able to understand too complex application. There, what you need to do is create patterns, have intuitive design. So if I am clicking on tab, my navigation goes from left to right on every page, and I do not have to worry. So that makes it less complex and easily understandable for an individual. The next is robust. This is basically this principle states that technology keeps evolving. The access points for any application keep evolving. I can access a web application through my tablet, through my laptop, or a web browser on my mobile. It should remain accessible through all these ways of accessing it. So compatibility basically leads into robustness of the application. Now, so these are the principles on which all the guidelines are based. And we would like to now talk about a specific standard which comes under WCAG. And Moksha, go ahead and take this since you're the expert here.
Okay. So let's understand the structure of specific variation of WCAG, that is 2.2. As we discussed, WCG principle, they are core of the WCAG, and it has in total 13 guidelines. So these all guidelines are based on these four principles, and those guidelines are further categorized into three success criteria, three conformance level basically, in order to meet the needs of different group and different situations. So these these conformance levels are A, double A, triple A, and A being the lowest one and triple A being the highest one. So conformance at higher level indicates conformance at lower level as well. By that means conforming to double A, we are not just confirming 13 or 14 criteria of it, but also mapping 25 criteria of single A as well in it.
Moksha, so if I'm does conformance levels A, double A, and triple A map to the level of disability that I'm catering to in terms of my user base?
Manisha, in a way, as we move from one level to another and the success criteria increases, making the same component of an application more and more accessible.
Okay. So if I'm the product owner and if I want to select the compliance level that I need to look into or the conformity level that I need to look into, I would basically look at my end user base and then decide whether I should go for AW or triple.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Now let's discuss about different guidelines of WCG 2.2. There are in total of 13 guidelines attached to those four principles of WCAG. So under each principle, there is a set of guidelines to address those. The first one is the perceivable. It has four guidelines. So these four guidelines are like text alternative, and these are based on time based, etc. like that. So typical issues we have observed in perceivable are for time based media. Like if we have moving banners or slides on an application, and if the application is not perceivable, then that banner, if it is continuously moving and flashing, a person having disability like scissor, they will not be able to perceive it. Then it will be a big challenge for them to perceive the application. Then comes the operable. Next, it has in total of 5 guidelines. So here is one additional guidelines in from 2.0. Operable has additional input modalities guideline from 2.0, and in 2.2 we have an additional success criteria in this principle. So typical issues we see here is web page objects are not being operated by keyboards. The next comes is understandable. So it has 3 guidelines. So we have seen a lot of issues in this for this principle, because predictability is very perception based, and its guidelines focus on making user interface intuitive and understandable. Then comes the robust. It has only one guideline for compatibility. So we have usually seen that applications are working on laptops, but they are not working on mobile phones. So another typical issue we have observed here is that content are not well formed to be passed successfully by different browsers and different assistive tools. So the entire goal here is to give the best experience, and the role of testing here is to make sure that it is implemented.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I think that brings us to the second phase of the entire webinar, where we're going to talk about testing. We'll touch base upon the typical testing process that is followed when we look into making an application accessible. What is an accessibility testing lab? What does it comprise of? Then what is the text approach, which is pertaining to the execution? We'll also get into accessibility testing aligning it with agile methodology, and how can you make accessibility testing a habit or a norm in your organization by setting up a practice. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is walk you through the entire process of accessibility testing. The first most important thing to identify when you're planning to make an application accessible is to identify the need for doing so. And that would probably lead to the compliance level. Now, if I have a web application, I'm an owner of a web application, I need to analyze the user base who will eventually be using the web application. If I know my user base is restricted, is not more than a certain number, is confirmed within my organization, and I know this will not be used by specially able people, you can either not go for, or if it is a policy in the organization, you can go for a single A-level compliance at this stage. So this is where you do sort of a pre-assessment of what is the need, and that derives the compliance level that you would want to meet for a web application or a mobile application. Second is identifying the environment through which the application will be accessed, and which all environments do you want to make it accessible on. I think this is best explained through an example. Say, and we've seen this in the past with the client, that a web application that was being built was being rolled out on IE with the disclaimer that it is accessible on IE. Now that zeroes in my scope on just IE, and I do not need to make it accessible with Chrome or on certain mobile devices and similar browser combinations. So identifying the environment through which the web applications will be, or the applications will be accessed, and realizing that which all of these combinations do you want to make the application accessible on, is a critical part of the entire exercise. And this is what identifying the environment on which it works basically means. Then comes identifying the scope, or the modules of the application. Now, any application has multiple sections in it, and not all of it needs to be made accessible. And the reason being is certain components of an application, for example, the admin section, or if there's a reporting section that is that basically looks at the usage of your app, of the application that has been rolled out to the market, these are exposed to certain set of audience, a control set of audience. Now, these can be benched, and they do not need to be part of the entire accessibility testing exercise. So identifying the scope is another important factor. Next comes selecting the right tools. Now, we'll get into the details of the kind of tools that are used or are needed to do accessibility testing later. But what we're trying to say here is that you've identified the compliance level. You've identified the endpoints on which it needs to be made accessible. You've also identified the components of the application that needs to be made accessible. Now, all of this leads to selecting and setting up a test lab, where we would be also setting up tools on which it needs to be tested, tools on which it needs to be compatible with. So this is where we've set up the right tools to test the entire thing. Now, next comes the execution phase, where we start by baselining the application. We test all the in-scope pages, and we report on the defects. Now, this execution can be done in an agile way, and it can also be aligned with the current sprint cycle that a company has or a product already has. Or it can be a separate effort completely, and it can be a big bang approach, also depending on the need of the app. Now, post the baselining comes the revalidation phase, where we retest the defects that have been reported earlier, and we see that through regression testing, then there's nothing that is broken while it has been fixed. And this is where we basically complete 2 good rounds of accessibility testing. Then comes the reporting, which itself is quite an extensive phase, because this yields a VP80 report, which we'll get into later, where we do multiple kinds of reporting, and VP80 reporting being one critical output of it. Now, this is the 7-point plan, which is followed for testing any application. The first 4 of these basically fall in the planning phase. The next 2 fall into the execution phase, and the last one, of course, is the reporting phase. Now, further, I think to elaborate on the 7-point plan, we can pick up a use case, and I think that's the best way to drill down on the planning phase. So, Moksha, if you could jump in here and take a recent use case that you've worked on and explain the planning phase to us.
Yes. So here I would like to share our recent experience of accessibility testing we performed for one of our consulting customer. So to start with the planning, we used the pre-assessment sheet to understand their needs of accessibility. And with this, we realized that it was only needed to do one internal thing. So they knew the audience it was catering for, and so confirming up to double level was enough for them. And the access point of the application were multiple, with each application to be accessed through Windows devices or Mac devices, and then we have different browsers on it. And it also included mobile devices. So it was an extensive testing. Then post that, the entire application was exposed to uncontrolled number of users, and we couldn't eliminate any part of it, and required to perform testing on everything. So even the super user panel and setting panel, all of it had to be accessible. So, and to achieve all this and to test the application, we used a combination of tools, that is automated tools and assisted tools. So we used a combination of them, and I will name just few here and we'll elaborate it later. And the automated tools were like JAWS Inspect, Sort Site, and like that. And assisted tools were like NVDA, JAWS, and VoiceOver.
Moksha, all of these tools that you mentioned, they're part of our workbench, right? The tool workbench that we have. So just to confirm, this must have been aligned with the workbench that we have internally, and you must have used those tools.
No, Manisha. Because of privacy concern, we had to use client devices, and we set up a dedicated lab for them.
Oh, all right. Got it. Got it. So great. So now that we're talking of a lab, I think we can get into a typical output of the planning phase, which is a testing lab that needs to be created for testing any application. Now there are three critical components of accessibility lab. The first is the device matrix, which derives the devices that will be part of the lab. Now, this device matrix is basically consists of devices and device and browser combinations on which a particular application should be tested. The second is a set of assistive tools. Now, what are assistive tools? These tools are basically made for specially able people to be able to access any web application. These do not test the application, they actually help specially able people. And whenever we're building a web application, it makes sense to zero in on the assistive tools that you want to make it compatible to through various strategies, whichever suits us. That do we want to go by what is market prevalent, or do we want to select certain assistive tools that our application needs to be compatible with? Now, these are deployed into the testing lab as well. Then come the evaluation tools. Now, these evaluation tools helps the tester to actually evaluate the application, one or the other aspect of the application on accessibility. Now, this is a sample device matrix that we created for one of our clients. Now, one of the things that you will notice here is for a Mac device, we've only considered Safari. And the reason being, it was a strategic call to reduce the scope of work. And the application was rolled out saying that on Mac, it is compatible with Safari. Moksha, please jump in for the assistive tools. I think you're the best person to take this.
So we have multiple assisted tools available in the market. So these could be screen recognition tools, or screen readers, screen magnification, or some special keyboards. The most recommended one are the screen readers, and those are JAWS and VoiceOver. And then we have certain automated tools. Actually, there are ample of automated tools available. So what we have chose like scanners like Sort Site, JAWS Inspect, Arc Toolkit, and Sort Site Improve, WCAG Contrast Checker. So these were some of the tools we have used to evaluate the website. Now, how do we identify these tools? What is the best for testing our applications? So we need to identify tools based on the accessibility. First thing is the accessibility standards. If you're evaluating against WCAG or Section 508, and if the second one would be if it is section WCAG, then consider it is if it is A or AA or AAA. And Then we should not forget the device matrix. We can also consider a device matrix during selection of our tools, like JAWS works best with the Chrome and IE. VoiceOver works with Mac OS and Safari, and automated tools like SortSite, it give best result based on the standards, if it is WCAG or Section 508. So this basically cover our planning phase. Now let's look into the execution phase. So before starting with the testing on different platforms or different devices, we need to perform some sanity check of the application. So if application comes to us, there is one sanity check done on that that would help in finalizing accessibility fit. So there's no point of doing accessibility if the application is unstable. And then after sanity check, automated scans are performed on the web pages using those automated tools. So this is where automated scanners come into picture, like SortSite, JAWS Inspect, as we just discussed. Then we have some manual analysis as well. So during the manual analysis, our accessibility experts, they come in to review the scan reports, root out false positives, and manually test areas which haven't been touched, which haven't been covered by automated tools. So good example here would be testing navigation of the application. So throughout this complete exercise, the predetermined assisted tools which are discussed are heavily used, and to ensure its compatibility.
Great. Muksha, a question here. Or rather, I would just add to what you said. Sanity check is the first filter, and the purpose of it is to check whether the application is stable before we get into a deep dive and doing automated scan. Having said that, say there are multiple work streams that are working in parallel. Say there's a work stream for functional testing, there's another one going for performance, and the build is simultaneously released for all these work streams. A one single sanity check, which gives us the assurance that the build release is stable, suffices for all three. So it need not be a dedicated filter for accessibility, because the purpose of it is same as for any other testing, is to find whether the application is stable enough to proceed or not.
Yes, absolutely.
Just go ahead. Thanks. Yeah.
Then one of the most important outcome of this complete exercise, of this complete accessibility testing, is the VPAT compliance report, that is voluntary product accessibility template. It contains information regarding how the product conforms with the accessibility standard. Now let's look at the some glimpse of the VPAT report. So VPAT report, it's a template that is advised by US government to evaluate the products that they are planning to procure from their vendors against certain accessibility criteria. Just to quickly show you what it looks like, it has three major sections, or we can say three tables for three different conformance level, that is A, double N, triple N. In this table field of the document, you provide specific of how the feature and the functionality of the product meet each technical requirement of accessibility standard. Apart from this VPAT report, there are few other reports that we can create or we can produce, and those reports could be detailed execution report and defect reports. So that these reports we can create. We also provide build on build report, and where you can compare the health of different builds of your application. And please note, these reports are often customized, or other reports can be added based on the client's need. So Manisha, this basically covers the 7-point plan, where we have covered the planning, the approach we take for execution, as well as the report we produce.
Yeah. So now that we have looked into the entire process and the details of the process in isolation, accessibility testing, let's see how it can be integrated into the agile methodology that any project or a product being built is following. Now there are simple steps to do this. The first is integrated into the development itself. This basically means creating a set of accessibility coding standards, like typical coding standards, having similar accessibility coding standards to follow for the developers, and making sure that before any build that is released to the testing team, there is some type level of unit testing that is done using the assistive tools with which the application needs to be compatible. So that sort of a check done at the development stage itself will ensure a better compliance. The next is making accessibility and acceptance requirement. Now, adding an accessibility criteria into any user stories acceptance requirement makes sure that you cannot close on a user story. You cannot say that it has been completed unless and until that particular element has been also checked. Now, that ensures that whatever is the impact of that user story, whenever it is released, it is also accessible, whatever is the impact of that. The third one is doing it early with each production release. Now, it's not just about adding, an acceptance criteria or things like that. It's basically early on deciding what is the compliance level that the application should meet, and making sure that build on build it is being tested against that compliance level by having probably a tester, dedicated tester who just tests the application on this. And then we're ensured that since the earlier, from the very beginning, maybe from the MVP itself, the application has been made accessible. So we're assured of having an end product towards the later releases also, which would be accessible to us and would comply with the level of compliance that we want to reach. So this is accessibility. Now, with the agile framework. Now we've talked, this probably gets applied at a product level or a project level. But now let's talk about how accessibility can be turned into a practice and a habit for an organization. How you can set up an entire COE around this. I think the first and the most important thing to do here is have a mature set of processes and having certain policies. I think the best way to describe this would be for an organization to say that all the applications that are rolled out need to be at least WCAG 2.1 AA compliant. This is a policy, and then I say, okay, if you want to deviate from this, if there's a special circumstances, I have a proper process in place for these exceptions that need to be followed and reported on. Another thing that can be done here is, have a standardization on the assistive tools. Pick up the most market prevalent assistive.
I would like to add here one thing on mature testing and reporting processes. So before this is done, it's important to look at all the type of application ERP custom build that an organization want to consider. So this will then help with the standardizing of the process and tools.
Absolutely fair. So Muksha, what you're talking about is probably the scoping exercise, and that's a fair point. So what we would need to do before we actually standardize this is look at the entire landscape of all the kind of applications we are dealing with. We're dealing with content management system. We're dealing with ERP products, and having different set of standards for that. So to be able to standardize, I need to understand the scope of the work, and that's one of the exercises that will probably happen before even the practice is set. Fair. Yeah. So when I was talking about mature policies and processes, one of the things that I do want to say is that when it comes to assistive tools, making sure that at an organization level we have a set of assistive tools which by default apply, and any application need to be compatible with those. Next comes the centralized tools and device portal. The purpose of creating a centralized set of devices on which you can test, or certain centralized tools, is to have the maximum optimal usage of automation scanners and assistive tools, and also make sure that there's no redundancy of having toolkits distributed. You have the latest versions you have available in your centralized workbench, accessible to be used by anybody who wants to. Then, of course, having a knowledge management center and training. This is where we keep all our learnings and we keep all our use cases, look at the typical pitfalls that we've seen and improve from that. And we use this knowledge and we use the skill of our people to upskill everybody in the organization, make them accessibility aware, and create sort of a habit amongst people to, while they're developing or while they're testing, to make application accessible. Now, the last point, of course, is continuous improvement. Any practice can continuously be improved. For example, if you have an SLA for an organization, that what is the amount of defect leakage for accessibility initially, this can be tightened over time and make sure that the leakage reduces. Also, having a central governing body which basically looks into and manages the entire practice and guides the practice in the organization really helps give it a very mature shape. So these are the four important components of setting up the accessibility COE within an organization. Now, with this, we come to the end of the session, and before we do that, I would just want to quickly wrap up and talk about what are the things that we covered, so that we're on the same page. We started with the web accessibility. What is the concept? We spoke about the standards. We got into WCAG. What are the four principles? They're basically called PORE, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Then we got into the 2.1, rather 2.2 structure. Then another important and probably takeaway would be the 7-point plan in accessibility testing that describes the entire workflow of accessibility testing. And then we, of course, got into the various phases under it and looked into agile alignment with accessibility and how do we set up a practice. Now, we are here at this point where we've covered up all the topics that we wanted to cover in this. And I think we are good to take some questions now. Let me look if we have any questions. Please feel free to post any of your questions in the window. We will be happy to take things up. Right now, I don't see much, or maybe this is because it's taking some time for it to reach me. Please go ahead and post any questions that you might have about the topic that we've done. We'll try and answer those and elaborate on anything that you want us to elaborate on. Okay, I think we have one. Let me just check. Okay, great. So the first question is from Shekhar, and he's asking, what's the difference between Section 508 and WCAG? Moksha, if it's okay, I'll take this, and if you have anything to add, just add to that. So, WCAG is basically applies globally, and it's a set of guidelines. It's not a law, and it is, again, we've elaborated on this enough, but let me tell you the difference again versus Section 508. Section 508 is applicable only in the US and on the federal agencies, and it is governed by a law. So basically, the federal agencies within US need to comply by Section 508. Now, if you want to do a mapping with WCAG, almost all of it, all of the the success criteria are available in WCAG, and Section 508 roughly maps to level A of WCAG. So that's the difference. Where prime difference is, one is global, the other one is for US federal agencies, and that's more like a mandate. Okay, so we have another question. Can you give example of a web application which is perceivable and operable at the same time? Great. I think that's a great question. So making an application operable and perceivable has many components to it, right? And it depends on the kind of audience that I'm looking at. Now, if I have an application which I'm able to understand, no matter what disability, with a certain disability that I have. So, for example, I am partially blind, right? But I have a assistive tool that I use which reads the screen and tells me whatever information there is. That makes that application perceivable to me. Now, at the same time, if I have a Braille keyboard which I can use to operate that application, that makes it operable also for me. So For a partially blind person, that becomes perceivable and operable at the same time. Having said that, it might not have features for for a person who has some other disability, and it might not be perceivable and operable to them. So that's where yeah, there's not a standard question, but I hope I could answer yours. That there are different elements that you can add to your application to make it perceivable and operable. Okay, so we have another question from Rajiv, which says, what are the tools which can help in automation of standards? Okay, so Muksha, do you want to talk about some of the scanners that we used for testing, any application?
Yeah, so to answer this, the typical automated scanners we used were JAWS Inspect, SortSight, and Arc Toolkit, and X Scanner. So all this scanner, what it does, it basically scans your entire website and find out the issues that are more to be programmatic. You cannot 100% rely on them. Obviously, it doesn't cover everything, because there are certain areas which these automated scanner doesn't reach. So their assisted tools and manual inspection comes in. But these are some of the automated tools we have used, JAWS Inspect and SortSight. There are ample of automated tools available, but as we had discussed, like we can decide, or we can choose those tools based on our needs or based on our requirements, or what
Yeah.
the conformance level standard is.
Yeah, so Rajiv, just to add to what she's saying, and when we're talking about automation, the tools are not sufficient enough to automate the entire testing right now. And I'll map it again back to a principle called, so we had understandable. In understandable, we talk about an application being intuitive, and intuitive for everybody means something else. Now, uh, a scanner is not able to define that intuitiveness, and a lot of guidelines under that fail when it comes to a scanner. So when it comes to automation, the capability of the tools right now is limited. Hopefully it'll evolve, but definitely a manual scan is also needed. Okay, so I'll jump to the next question. Jaspreet, we have another one from you. You're asking, please go through WCAG 2.2 conformity levels again. Okay, so I think the conformity levels over the various standards by WCAG has remained the same. They are A, AA, and AAA. Now, the guidelines under these conformity levels and the success criteria that you need to meet under these conformity levels has changed over time. For 2.2, there has been an addition of a success criteria that Muksha explained while she was doing it. So to quickly answer your question, conformity levels are same: A, AA, AAA. And for each these conformity levels, there are different level of success criteria that you need to meet to reach this level. These are all sequential. So if you're at AA, you're automatically have crossed A, you're already compliant at A if you're at AAA. Industry-wide, the most advised level of compliance is AA, right, Muksha?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
double.
Okay, great. So we have a question from Yogesh where we're saying that when linking to PDF documents on your site, is there a recommendation on making those more accessible? Okay, great. PDF documents, Moksha, your forte. Please take it.
Thank you. So, in general, PDFs are not easily read by certain assisted tool as an HTML page. So, actually, WCG guidelines recommend having your content on an HTML page, even if it is in PDF. So, but it cannot be happen every time. And if PDF needs to be downloaded, then it suggests that a summary about it could be provided before the person can download it, and that can be helpful for them.
Okay, great. Okay, this is an interesting question. This is a great question, Shekhar. He's asking, what is WA ARIA? Is it another compliance level? Okay, so ARIA basically stands for Accessible Rich Interface Applications. Now, initially, when WCAG 1.0 was set up, it was set up at a time when the technology of creating web applications hadn't evolved so much. So it gave a certain set of guidelines to developers on how to create a web application, which is very specific. Now, when it came to WCAG 2.0, that's where they started making the guidelines technology agnostic, making sure that they are applicable to multiple technologies. Now, what that lacked was specific instructions. So what ARIA does is it gives specific rules to developers to follow. And this is mostly for dynamic content that is created using Ajax and JavaScript. And to make sure that if you follow these rules for while you're creating such a content, it will become accessible. I think we have overshot on time. Let me see if we can take one more. We have a question from Akash saying, please suggest how to master an accessibility testing. Akash, that's a great question. I think we still ourselves consider that we are learning. We haven't yet mastered it. We want to master it too. Uh, Please learn as much as you can. Execute, use assistive tools. There are free assistive tools available. There are free scanners available. Please use those, and you'll learn a lot by getting your hands dirty.
And adding to this, there are certain certifications are also available to which will help you learn about accessibility.
Yeah, thanks, Moksha. Thanks. So I think we do have a few more questions, and what we will do is, because we are running short on time, we will get back to you on these questions. We will, write back to you, use the details that we have, and we will respond to your questions. Thank you so much for attending the session today, taking out time, and coming and joining us for this. Please feel free to write to us if for any follow-up queries on accessibility COE at CresTechGlobal.com or info@CresTechGlobal.com, or you can reach out to us on that number. Please know that the entire webinar has been recorded, and this will be posted on our website, and we'll share the link with you so that you can reference it later for any use that you might have. Again, Moksha, do you want to say anything?
Thank you all for attending this accessibility, and we hope we could and we hope like we'll get the questions from you and we could answer it in the way you want.
Thank you. Again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.